morning, everyone. It is wonderful to see everybody. I am impressed by how many people are here so early after a Thanksgiving weekend. It's great that we're here to feed both your mind and your body. I think if you're like me this weekend, you need less of the feeding the body. So this morning we're going to be talking about crisis management and really best practices in crisis management, and think a bit about how companies that do it well perhaps look differently than companies that do not. And so in that regard, what we want to think about is that crises can take all kinds of forms, and they can happen very differently as well. They can be something very sudden and dramatic, or they can be something gradual that takes time to develop. And if you haven't stopped to think about what these crises might look like, you might find yourself in the middle of one without really realizing it. What we really are interested in this morning is a pretty broad idea of crisis. So in this case, we're going to say a crisis is anything that threatens health and safety, that can put your business operations at risk, that may pose a financial, legal, or regulatory risk, and that may threaten your reputation or your goodwill. With that in mind, I'd like to just ask, this is the audience participation part, so how many of you in the last 5 years have lived through some sort of crisis? So that's pretty amazing. For how many of you did that crisis unfold just as you planned or imagined it? Yeah, not so many, eh? That's what's really interesting, I think, is that this idea is that really crises are inevitable. We will all face one at some time. And in fact, the statistics would say that that every 4 or 5 years, probably, a large corporation would, in fact, face a crisis. And a CEO is likely to face a crisis at least once during their tenure, but Gianna is special, so she gets to share her experience from more than one crisis. And as I said before, crises can take many, many different types of forms, and they can be something very sudden and accidental, or sudden and very preventable. They could be something that happens to you and you find yourself in the midst of. They can be something which is really related to consumer confidence. They can be something which, in fact, come from the company itself, an act of commission or omission on the part of the company. And they can be large industrial accidents that affect not only the company but communities as well. So there's all kinds of crises that we can think of. And what we really want to think about today is we're going to take you through the 4 phases of crisis management, and really want to touch into some of the best practices around crisis management, and again think about what is it that helps companies weather those storms well. And what I find quite amazing when it comes to crisis management, and if you think about all the crises that you have seen unfold in the media, is that really these best practices are quite simple to articulate. They are not particularly complicated, and yet they're very difficult to enact in practice, or at least they certainly can be. So with that in mind, I would like to invite Gianna up onto the stage. Gianna, who has not only, like I said, lived through one crisis in her tenure as CEO, but in fact has dealt with fire and with flood and with snow, and she has lived to tell about it. So Gianna, if you can share some of your experience.
Sure, Anne, and good morning, everyone. It is great to see you here. First of all, I know that most of you, or many of you, are familiar with Inmax. That is the company that I lead. For all of you who are Inmax customers, thank you. We do appreciate your business. And what I'm going to do here today is just give you a little bit of insight into Inmax for those of you who may be less familiar, but really turn our attention to bringing this concept of crisis management and dealing with crisis to life. And I'm going to give you a few examples of some of the things that we experienced through the lens of some of the crises that we were dealing with over the last 2.5 years here in Calgary. So first of all, just a quick snippet for those of you who aren't maybe not so familiar with Inmax. Inmax is a leading electricity company here in Alberta. We're based here in Calgary. We are the largest generator and of generation assets in Alberta, and we are the largest seller of electricity across Alberta. Now, more germane to the conversation this morning is we also own and operate the wires that deliver electricity here in Calgary. So we literally do keep the lights on, or at least that's our intended objective here in Calgary, and it really is where we'll focus around the events that we dealt with the last couple of years. So if you want to take a look at the screen, I'm going to take you through a little bit, starting with June 2013, the flood here in Calgary. It took us 8 days to fully restore the power to the homes that were safe enough to be able to have that electricity back into their home. I know many of you experienced this rather personally. Then going ahead to September 2014, affectionately known as Snowtember. This particular event across Calgary was actually for Inmax more difficult. We had more customers out of power. It was widespread and random across the city, especially those areas with trees, as you can see here. And then finally, October 2014, and in fact it was a year ago this Thanksgiving weekend, where we dealt with an unexpected fire underground in our system that destroyed the Inmax system, and we had power outages for about a 17 square block area just in this part of downtown, and it took us 5 days to restore power while we rebuilt the system. So Anne is going to talk us through our useful framework, and I'm going to interject with some examples drawn from these 3 different events on some of the lessons that we learned and some of the experiences that we had. So Anne?
Okay, thanks, Gianna. So here we have the stages of crisis management, beginning with prevention and then preparation, recovery, and response. And we're going to really focus on preparation, response, and recovery, and particularly response and really living inside this crisis bubble. But I just want to start with one really key point around prevention, and that is that good crisis management begins with coming up with a realistic set of scenarios that you're working from. And the key there is, we all know that prevention is really the best way of avoiding a crisis. So if you never find yourself in crisis, you will be in far better shape than if you're trying to mitigate it after the fact. And one of the key things to remember there is that sometimes companies just are not realistic about what could happen. So good crisis management starts with that, to really be awake to and aware of the different things that can happen, because that leads you on to the preparation piece. And in the preparation aspect, good preparedness is worth a lot. And there, really the key is to identify what can happen, and again, being realistic in that way, because many crises that unfold are very predictable. They are something that realistically could happen, and so there's really no reason not to have good plans in place to how to manage them. So that basically means really 3 things, and that means putting procedures in place, knowing what the roles are of different people, and knowing what the responsibilities are. So those very 3 key ingredients, so that in the crisis, people know what to do, and they're not trying to figure things out in the moment. The second thing to just keep in mind is that it needs to be ongoing. As the environment changes, as stakeholders change, as the environment changes, these plans need to be revisited. And with that is this idea of really practicing what your crisis management plan looks like, so that there's always an opportunity to adjust. So I'm just curious, Gianna, I mean, from a preparedness standpoint, what does crisis management look like for Inmax?
Well, I think picking up on a couple things you said that are so critical. I mean, my kind of roadmap around how to do this in terms of preparedness is plan, 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 practice, practice, practice. and then realize that you can't anticipate everything. But you're as prepared as you could possibly be. And at Inmax, what this looks like is we have frameworks. We have a rigorous process that we go through. We have people assigned the duty and responsibility to ensure we are going through these drills. Part of our drills also involves coordinating with some of our agencies, like the Calgary Emergency Management Agency, and we do tabletop exercises with them. So we do a lot of things internal, just within the organization, to plan, prepare, and practice. And we also coordinate, plan, prepare, and practice with some of our other responding organizations that we know we would be in this crisis with and work together with. The thing that is a big takeaway from me, and it really is that point about expect the unexpected. But that is not an excuse to say we can't possibly think about everything that will happen. That is never an excuse to not prepare. In fact, I think it's the exact opposite. The lesson that I've seen with Inmax, and for all three of these events that I talked about, we in some form or fashion had anticipated them. And in fact, January 2013, we had approached the city about doing a scenario that involved a flood of downtown. We didn't realize it would be so relevant just a few months later. But because we were so prepared, and I think Inmax was able to handle these crises so well and respond so rapidly, was because of that preparation. Because here's what really happened. We had situations like the flood, like the snowstorm, that actually went well beyond our planning scenarios. But because we had thought about all the things we could think about, and when I say that, I mean, this is everything from who's going to have the responsibility to deliver meals to our crews, because we're running people 24 hours a day. Who's going to supply those meals? It's detail like that. Because we had thought about the things that we could possibly think about, we were able to use our time and attention during the crisis, focusing on those things that we couldn't anticipate. So we were able to respond more rapidly and use our time there. The last thing you want to be doing during a crisis is actually thinking about what you could have covered and what you could have thought about. You want to use your time to think about things you couldn't anticipate. So you want to go into these well prepared, and I've got an example here. You look at the screen here. We mentioned roles and responsibilities. I'm going to give you a little bit of insight into a framework that we put in place. This was actually a lesson learned from the flood that we implemented prior to the other two crises we had in 2014. And it has to do with the roles and responsibilities of the board of directors compared to that of management and the CEO. And this is something that you don't often, I haven't heard a lot of people talk about. We hadn't anticipated. But it's a framework that we now have in place, and it's really quite simple. What we have on the board is a simple illustration of it. But I will tell you, it's actually only on one page, and it's not mouse prints. You can actually read it. So it's not all that complicated, and it's simply this. It defines in advance what are the expectations and the roles and responsibilities of the CEO in particular compared to the board of directors or the board chair. If it's an operational crisis, and the three that we're citing here today were all considered operational crisis, then in that type of situation, the CEO has the lead responsibility to not only lead the organization and the crisis, but also as the lead spokesperson publicly. Now, as CEO, we have mechanisms in place now that we will keep the board apprised, typically daily. There's a dial-in number they can call. We can send them out a message once a day, so they are kept up to speed. In addition to that, it's the prerogative of the CEO if they need additional assistance. If I need additional assistance, I can call any one of those board members, but particularly the board chair, to come in and step in and assist in whatever manner that we think would be helpful. So the board is up to speed, but it's the lead role of the CEO. If it's a crisis of what we call governance, sometimes that might be called crisis of confidence in the company, or it's any crisis really involving the CEO, then that same accountability and responsibility is that of the board, in particular the board chair. Now, you can't really see it on this slide, it's a little hard to read, but there's an arrow between operational crisis and governance crisis, if for some reason something starts out as an operational crisis. But for whatever reason, the CEO is ineffective. Hopefully that's not the case, but it does happen at times. We can think of some examples of maybe that's where we've seen that happen. Then it becomes a crisis of confidence or a crisis of governance, and then it transitions over to the board. We use this framework for the couple of the last two crises, and I can tell you that it was so instrumental in having clear lines of communication and expectation between me and my team and the board of directors, and it helped us respond much better. We knew what to expect.
Okay. Which takes us to the next part, which is the fun part, and that's you're in it. You're in this crisis bubble, and everything is happening. And as Gianna mentioned, you can plan and prepare and practice and plan and prepare and practice, but the reality is you can't plan for everything. And the reality is that there will be things that happen that are unanticipated, they're unexpected, and they're unplanned for. And so the key then becomes, what do you do? And so one of the things that the literature would say makes a difference between those companies that manage these well and those that don't, the key really is corporate culture. The key really is how are employees within the organization empowered to make decisions? Do they have the leadership capability? Do they have the right training? Are they actually empowered to face a situation that the crisis plan does not address and to make the right decision? Or sometimes make the wrong decision, but be at least not so afraid that they won't make a decision. So in that regard, this sort of idea of really being able to respond in the moment to whatever is happening is really a key piece. And as Gianna mentioned, you can plan for what you can plan for, but it's all the other stuff, perhaps, that makes the crisis really a much more difficult scenario. So I'm going to let Gianna share her experience in that regard as well.
Well, first of all, we called today's session Inside the Crisis Bubble. And that's a phrase that I use because having gone through these a number of times now, when a crisis hits, your life as you know it and the world as you know it totally changes. And not only for yourself as perhaps a leader, but for your organization as well. And what happens in that situation is it's really interesting because you're almost in a cocoon in one regard because everything around you or you're in this bubble is solely focused on that crisis. While at the same time, your company is more exposed publicly than ever before. So there are really two things that when I think about response that determines, or at least from the outside, determines whether or not your response is successful. And the first is how you actually respond. And in Inmax's case, that was the restoration of power. How did we do it? How quickly did we do it? The second criteria from my perspective is how you are perceived to have responded. And that has a lot to do with the first one, but there are a lot of other factors as to how you're perceived. And the thing about how being perceived is that perception goes well beyond the people that are affected by that crisis as to what their judgment is of you on how you actually handled the crisis. So I think a really good crisis response requires both of those things to sort of be front and center and be part of the thought process.
Mm-hmm. And clearly, part of that is how you communicate with people. And again, this is where many companies fall down. And again, it shouldn't be that complicated. For example, one of the key rules is tell the truth. That's not a hard rule, is it? Another key rule is to really be responsive and to be timely, to provide information in a timely manner. And then also really not just to talk, but to listen. And so especially in the social media age, one of the things that companies have had to learn is they need to listen to what other people are saying.
Yes, I will say social media is huge. And one of the things that we saw between June of 2013 with the flood and September of 2014, just in that short period of time, our experience with Inmax really showed the explosion of social media and how particularly things like Twitter, really real-time, in-time type of social media and the effect that it had I found even using Twitter to be a very useful tool. It can kind of be a force of good and evil, for some perhaps would say. But in the case of being able to keep up with the social context, what's going on? What are people thinking? What are people experiencing? It's a really effective and important tool, particularly Twitter. But I will tell you, I found a couple things you can see on the slide here. A couple of things to recognize is that it is a 24-hour news cycle, and everyone is a reporter today. If you take a look at that picture, that's people at the street corner from the fire, and they were all tweeting and reporting out in real time what was taking place. The other thing that I've learned is that people are looking for and listening for competence, but they're also really looking for the face of humanity in a company. Are you hiding behind that logo? Are you hiding behind corporate speak? Or are you being real and being true? And I think that was a huge lesson for us. The thing about this is, we talk about communications up here. We say communications matters. Now, first priority for us in a crisis are those people who are most directly impacted. Now, as management, we all know, and many of you in this room know, that part of our responsibility also is to safeguard the corporation and the duties and responsibilities to the corporation as well. So I can promise you that in any crisis, there are a bevy of attorneys who are giving you advice. And this is actually not a criticism. In fact, that's what they're doing their job. Their job is to advise the leadership of exposures and risks and things, but they will say what you can do, what you can't do, what you should say, what you shouldn't say. But one of the things that's so important, and I give our attorneys at Inmax a lot of really good credit on this one, is there are the legalities that do come into play often around exposures around a crisis, but you have to step back and think about the broader context. And that broader context takes into account that social accountability and that social responsibility. So, one of the things that I think is just so important is making sure that we keep that in mind all the time when we're talking about communicating during a crisis. So let me give you an example. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the experience we had during the flood. In the early days of the flood, we were working 24 hours, and as part of our team, we were monitoring social media, and as part of our team, we had a communications individual, or several of them, 24 hours a day monitoring the Twitter feed and using that as a vehicle to put out communications and to communicate to people. We didn't know a lot at that time. We were still dealing with flood, so we weren't yet really restoring the system. But being the relative conservative company we are, and for a number of reasons, we had a series of sort of pre-approved, canned Twitter responses that we were replying. So we were replying to Twitter with these fairly generic canned responses. 3 or 4 basic ones. We started reading and monitoring, and we were constantly monitoring, including myself. I was looking at on my iPad all the time. What's going on out there? And part of the way to see that was the conversation coming through Twitter. And people will write and say anything over Twitter. But what we started to notice is people were beginning to be frustrated, and quite candidly, they were beginning to turn on Inmax a little bit. And it wasn't so much because they didn't have power, but it was a bit because we weren't really connecting with them. We weren't talking with them. And then we got this tweet. Inmax, you're doing your best, but if I don't get power to my electric trimmer soon, my groinal body hair is going to be a state of emergency. We were pretty worn out at this time. I don't think we were getting any sleep. And I have to say that even to our team, we read that and we just stopped. I don't know who this person is. Maybe they're in the room. We won't go there. I'll keep going. The fact is, what this tweet brought to the fore was that social media changes anything. It's not a one-way conversation. It is a communication. And what people want more than anything on social media is that humanity, and they want to be responded to, not a generic tweet. They want to be responded to this. So after seeing this tweet, actually, what we did is we unleashed our communication team. And we said, forget the canned messages. Reply to this person. In fact, I think our reply was something like, thanks for the laugh. We really needed it. We're working as hard as we can. But we responded, and after that, we started putting out other tweets, and we started responding more humanly. We threw out the canned messages. And as a result of that, things started to change. And what we started to get were emails about the humanity of it all. And so I just wanted to say that part of this is a lesson in empowerment. I had to trust our social media team and our communication team to, in the moment, make the call, nothing pre-approved, communicate, do your job, get out there and do what you're trained to do and connect with people. The other lesson was communication is not what you need here. What you really need, we say communications matters, but in a crisis what really matters is connecting to the people, the public, the people affected in a way that's human and shows even sometimes you don't have all the answers, but you're going to keep them up to speed on the things that you do and that you care. And that was a turning point for us, and we started to get more response. The other thing very quickly is also outreach. During the flood, we recognized that half of our company was doing communication. Half of our company was responding to the outage. The other half wanted to help. So reaching out in the community and doing whatever you can well beyond what it is you're supposed to do is another lesson in sort of how to engage and how to respond effectively.
That's terrific. Okay. The last stage then is recovery, and so you've made it through the crisis and everybody's breathing a sigh of relief. And now there might be a real push to try to get back to normal, and everybody almost wants to put it behind them. But the most important thing now really is to stop and to reflect and to learn. So living through the experience can teach you a lot, but it's really the reflection on the experience where the learnings will come. How did the crisis unfold? What did we do well? What really can we do better? So that the next time we face a crisis, we'll be even better prepared. And again, Gianna had no idea just how soon she was going to be able to use what she learned in the last crisis.
That's right. I mean, it's I think for us, we are a learning organization, and a couple of the examples that I've given you here were some lessons that we learned during the crises, and we didn't, for example, like the Twitter lesson, change what we're doing. So that was something we started to see, and we needed to learn that lesson right then and there, not wait for some formal process to actually change and to introduce that lesson learned. And so we adjusted through these crises to respond on the way. And then, of course, after each of these events, and more than that, even just routinely, when we see other crises occur, we will get together and we'll say, okay, what worked, what didn't? Simple questions. What worked, what didn't? What can we do better? What can we prevent? And how can we respond differently? So I've given a couple of examples like this the stakeholder map with our board of directors. That was a clear lesson from the flood. We used it following that, and we use that now always. The Twitter, that was another example. And just knowing that you have to empower your organization. Make sure you have the right people before you go into battle, if you will. And but recognize that there are 1,000 decisions that have to take place. It can't all be done in your normal process, perhaps your normal chain of command. You have to have some process to follow, but also if you're responding like we are, where you've got hundreds of people on the ground, you have to empower them and let them make those decisions and trust them and give them the tools to do it. So that's also been one of our big lessons.
And part of that reflection, hopefully, will also lead to the fact that there are and can be some very positive results of crises. And you've given some very good examples. And essentially, becoming a more resilient organization is one of those positive outcomes. So as I started with earlier, I said, these things are really easy to articulate, but in the crisis bubble, they can be a lot harder to, in fact, put into place. So nobody will ever have the perfect crisis management plan. By planning well, however, by communicating well, and by really being willing to act, companies will weather that storm much better. So thank you very much.
So my first question is for Anne. To me, there's two things going on. There's one of kind of, yeah, we've got our list of things, we can tick it off, we've done the planning, but there is a really underlying sense of intuitive judgment that, you know, sometimes you've got to go with your gut as opposed to what's on the screen. Has there been any research done on that?
There has been some, and I would say that that really is the piece that's much harder. So the tangible piece in terms of having the plan in place, I'll say what the hard side of crisis management or the hard side of risk management, meaning the pieces that you can put the policies in place, the procedures in place, et cetera. But it's really the soft side that companies often struggle with, and that is the corporate culture side and how people, again, make decisions and who are the people in your organization. But that's really what sets companies apart. And so, again, being in a culture where employees aren't afraid to make decisions, that they're not afraid to make mistakes, that they use their best judgment in the moment. But that's the harder piece, arguably.
And Gianna, I have a question for you. As I was sitting there listening and you talked about the need to be ahead and working with external stakeholders, if I said to you as an organization, what were your critical external stakeholders, even identified before a crisis?
Great question. Critical, it's obviously going to be different depending on the business that you're in. But for us, government, all levels of government, particularly provincial and local, and that government extends into key department heads and things like that. So we had a group of people whose job it was to make sure that our key messages were getting into the hands of the Prime Minister, the Premier, the Mayor, the City Council, and other key stakeholders. Another one for us here in Calgary was really critical, are people like the Chamber of Commerce. So a real shout out to them. They not only were a key stakeholder, they were a partner. They had access to small customers, or businesses. And so we would coordinate, give them information, and they would help distribute. Because a lot of times in a crisis, getting the information into the hands of the people who need to know is one of your biggest challenges. During the flood, even some of our partners and our suppliers like TELUS, Shaw, they helped push messages through text messages on our behalf to help communicate to people in need. So it takes a variety of plays, and we have different people assigned to reach out to those different groups now. We've refined that with practice or with real life, those are critical relationships to think through. So I talk about being inside the bubble. As a company, you get inside the bubble. It's so critical that you have people assigned to keep reaching out and looking out beyond the bubble, not just from within your own perspective.
Okay, thanks. Are there questions from the floor?
Gianna, this is a tough question and you may not want to answer it. But
he's going to ask anyway. That's okay.
But I'm going to ask anyway. So what would you have done differently, and how would you rate your response overall out of 10?
We're a pretty critical organization. What we have done differently? Well, I'd say, from those lessons, there's always things that we would do differently. I mean, the example I gave around the flood. I think I wish we had recognized sooner. There's a huge personal tragedy that was taking place in our city. We saw that, we could tell that, but being able to recognize that and respond to people from a communication perspective with that heart that we eventually began to do after a few days, I wish we had done it from the get-go. And I think we did that on the others. Some of the other things wish we had I'd say the list is actually surprisingly short as to what we had done differently, because I mentioned how prepared we were and we could focus on the things that we hadn't prepared for. When it came to the flood, Inmax restored power in half the time that we had expected to when we sort of ran the plan. When it came to the flood, we came to the fire, similar. We were able to do it in an accelerated way. That was because we gave our organization and the people in it the license to get creative, figure out things. It's not in the book. Get in there and figure out new and different ways to be able to restore our system. So I'm actually very proud of the response and how we did it. Do I wish we had been able to restore power in 4 days instead of 8 or 1 day? Absolutely. But I'm really proud of the response that we did. So for those people who were out of power for that length of time, probably wasn't fast enough. We know that. But given the circumstances and the conditions, surprisingly few things we would totally do differently, but a lot of small learnings that when you add it all together helps us respond better going forward. Thank you. Thank you, Lucy. No scores, but it's not a 10. There's always things you can do better. I will say that. Up or top.
Okay, I think there's somebody at the back, okay?
My question is, usually companies respond in a way that they use their core activities. I will connect the water, electricity, gas, but how about helping people in terms of how they feel, their distress? The impact is not that I lost the power, but I haven't slept, I haven't eaten because there is no power to cook, I haven't seen my favorite program, so I'm totally in distress. So, and I know that's not your core activity. But do you have some partnerships to help in that human side and show that you are helping beyond what you can?
Yeah, that's a really great question. We partner with a lot of community agencies, for example. One that comes right to mind is the Distress Center. And one of the things that we did, and Aspen Family Network as well, but the Distress Center in particular, following these crises, particularly the flood, they saw a huge increase in the need for their services. So what Inmax has done, and as we've always had a relationship with them, but we increased our donation. We've actually helped supply additional resources to them on an ongoing basis, and we often refer customers or people who will get in contact with us to them. So that's one example. Some of the other things, you saw some of the slides of us going into the community. We put an army of volunteers out in some of the hardest hit areas in Calgary and also High River. At the same time we were trying to respond. Now, I appreciate last year a lot of people didn't get their turkey dinner. We talked a lot about how do we make that up to them, but we tried. Now, the first priority, of course, is responding to the crisis, and our biggest job we can do is make sure that, first of all the resources necessary are going to restore power in our case, but where we had excess resources during the time, we tried to deploy it out in other ways. I think there are some other opportunities. It depends on the particular crisis, and we'll always look to be able to round out that response depending on the circumstances that we're dealing with. But it doesn't stop, by the way, when the crisis is over. These are some of our executives went out to High River for weeks afterwards. Again, I mentioned we've supported a place like Distress Center, and we still do today. In large part because of some of the increase in need that they had that came out of some of these crises that we dealt with.
Okay, we have time for one last question.
This question is for Ann. I just wonder if you'd like to comment on Volkswagen's handling of their crisis.
Initially, I thought they were saying the right things, but when the president was in front of the U.S. Congress, I think he lost some serious ground. And as an organization, to say that there were some individuals that did this and it wasn't us, it was these individuals, I think that they lost a lot of goodwill at that point. And I quite frankly, I'm just stunned by the whole thing, and this is such a good example of not something that happens to you, but that something really is a sin of commission on the part of the company. And so I think they might weather the storm only because they're Volkswagen and they have the resources kind of like BP did. But I think it's going to be a long storm.